Welcome to another deep dive, and this time we're tackling Saint Augustine.
Oh, Augustine. Yeah, always a fascinating figure.
He really is. And to guide us, we have excerpts from a book called El Doctor de la Gracia contra el Mal.
Oh.
And that's by E.A. Del Maschio. Just a heads up, this book is in Spanish.
Okay.
But it's not a straight biography.
Mm-hmm.
It really gets into the philosophy behind Augustine's life and thought.
Interesting.
So, ready to see what insights we can uncover?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
Okay, so first things first. Augustine didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Right.
He lived in a really interesting period.
He did. I mean, you're talking about the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. Things were really changing. It was crumbling. Yeah. And the old pagan beliefs, they were clashing with this new force, Christianity.
Yeah, all this upheaval, so much uncertainty.
Exactly. So, yeah, it was a really interesting time for someone like Augustine to be alive.
I can only imagine. I mean, would you say that this atmosphere, all this change and uncertainty had an impact on how he developed intellectually?
Oh, without a doubt. But it wasn't just the big picture stuff, like the fall of Rome.
Okay.
Augustine's own personal life, it was pretty wild, really a roller coaster ride. Oh, yeah. I mean, his younger years in Carthage, think wild living,
Yeah.
But then you've got his mom, Monica, a very devout Christian. And her influence, it's always there.
So you've got these contrasting forces.
Right. And then, to make things even more interesting, he gets involved with the Manichaeans.
The Manichaeans, that was, remind me, what was their deal again?
Very strict, very dualistic, good versus evil, light versus darkness, that kind of thing.
Right, right.
And all of that, all those experiences, they really shaped Augustine's journey and how he formed his ideas.
So it's like his personal struggles kind of mirrored all the upheaval going on around him.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. And this is where it gets really fascinating because eventually Augustine finds some intellectual piece, or at least a framework, in Neoplatonism.
Neoplatonism. Okay, we're going way back now.
Right. But the core idea is like, there's the one, the transcendent source of everything.
Okay.
Then you've got the knownness, that's divine thought, the intellect.
I see.
And of course, the soul. All of this, it resonated with Augustine.
I can see how those ideas would appeal to someone searching for answers.
Absolutely. But Augustine was never one to just take things at face value.
No.
He wasn't just going to adopt Neoplatonism wholesale. He kind of molded it, shaped it to fit with Christian doctrine.
That sounds pretty controversial, to say the least.
Yeah.
Mixing philosophy and religion like that.
Oh, it definitely raised eyebrows. Centuries later, you even have Nietzsche weighing in.
Nietzsche. Wow. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
What did he have to say about it?
Well, he called Christianity Platonism for the masses. Basically, a watered-down version.
Oh, that's a bit harsh.
It is. But agree with Nietzsche or not, Augustine's fusion of Neoplatonism and Christianity, it left a mark. A big one.
Okay, so break it down for me. How did Augustine even manage to merge those two seemingly different systems of thought?
He was clever. You see, in Neoplatonism, you've got the one, the source of everything. Augustine equated that with the Christian God.
Ah, I see. Making connections.
Exactly. And the nous, that divine mind, well, he saw that as a parallel to the Logos, the Word of God.
So he's drawing these parallels, making Neoplatonism a little more palatable to the intellectuals who are already gravitating towards Christianity.
You got it. And that strategy, it worked. It really helped to elevate Christianity's status, gave it some intellectual weight.
So Augustine wasn't just a theologian, he was also a bit of a PR genius.
You could say that. He knew how to use the intellectual currents of his time to Christianity's advantage.
Pretty impressive. But it wasn't just about adapting ideas.
No.
He also wrestles with some of those really big questions we still grapple with today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like the problem of evil.
Ah, yes. How can a God who is all good and all-powerful allow suffering to exist?
It's something we still struggle with. What was Augustine's take on all of this?
Well, Augustine, he believed that evil wasn't a thing in itself, more like an absence of good.
Okay.
He used this analogy, darkness is just the absence of light.
I see.
And evil is just the absence of God's goodness.
That's an interesting concept, but I'm not sure it completely solves the problem.
Right. I mean, it's a good starting point. But if God is all-powerful, all good, why would he create a world where imperfection, and therefore evil, is even possible?
Wouldn't a perfect world, a world without any evil at all, be a better reflection of God's goodness?
It's a good question. But remember, Augustine was writing for believers. He wasn't trying to convert skeptics.
So it was more about giving believers a framework to understand evil within their existing faith.
Exactly. He wasn't necessarily trying to provide a universal solution to the problem of evil.
That makes sense. Okay, so even if we accept this idea of evil as a lack of goodness, doesn't that kind of suggest that we as humans are inherently flawed, that we can't really achieve true goodness on our own?
It's a good point. And that actually leads us to one of Augustine's most important contributions, his challenge to this old idea called intellectualism.
Intellectualism. So what is that?
Basically the idea that if you know what's good, you'll do what's good. Knowledge equals action.
Oh, I see.
But Augustine, he disagreed. He looked at his own life, his own struggles, especially his younger years, all that temptation. He realized it's not that simple.
So knowing the good doesn't automatically mean you'll do the good.
Exactly. And for Augustine, human will, it plays a huge role in our moral choices.
Okay, so we have a will. But if our will is flawed, tainted by this imperfection, this lack of goodness, how can we ever choose to do the right thing?
And this is where Augustine brings in this idea of grace. He believed that our will alone, it's just not enough. We need help. We need divine help. A little push from God to move us towards the good.
So it's this divine intervention, this grace, that allows us to overcome our flaws and make the right choices.
Exactly. It's this concept that really gets to the heart of Augustine's thinking.
This idea of grace versus free will, I can see why it sparked so much debate. It's still something we grapple with today.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But before we go down that rabbit hole, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another controversy Augustine found himself in. The Donatist challenge.
The Donatists, weren't they all about having a pure church?
Exactly. They believed the church should only include the truly righteous. And they also had this issue with sacraments. They said sacraments performed by priests who, wavered during the Roman persecutions weren't valid.
So they were pretty exclusive about who belonged and who could lead.
Very much so.
And what did Augustine think about all this?
Well, Augustine was all about unity, about the universality of the church. He argued that trying to separate the visible church with all its imperfections from some kind of invisible, pure church was a bad idea, a dangerous idea.
Dangerous how?
Well, it could be used to excuse all kinds of bad behavior from church leaders. It could create divisions within the Christian community.
So Augustine saw the church as a place for everyone, a place for forgiveness and redemption.
Exactly, regardless of past mistakes.
That's a much more inclusive vision than the Donatists. But I can see how some people might be worried about compromising standards. I mean, if you're welcoming everyone, even those who seriously messed up, isn't there a risk of lowering the bar?
I see your point. And that's a tension that plays out in many religious institutions even today. How do you balance this idea of purity with the reality that humans, well, we're not perfect?
Right.
Augustine's solution, it was to really emphasize the power of God's grace. He believed that even the worst sinner could find redemption through the church's teachings and sacraments. Welcome back to our deep dive on Saint Augustine. When we left off, we were talking about his concept of grace, a theme that runs through so much of his work.
Yeah, it seemed like grace was right at the center of a lot of those theological debates he got into, like with the Donatists.
Right. And as we go deeper into Augustine's ideas about grace, we run into one of the most controversial and, honestly, most enduring debates. His work sparked predestination.
Oh, predestination, yeah. So that's the idea that God's already picked who's getting into heaven, like even before they're born.
It's definitely a simplified way to put it, but you've got the gist of it. And for Augustine, grace wasn't just like a little help along the way. It was absolutely essential, like the key to getting into heaven. He thought that because of original sin, human nature, it's so messed up that we just can't choose good on our own. We need God to step in to give us his irresistible grace if we're going to be saved.
So does that mean we're all just puppets? Like if our destiny is predetermined, do our choices even matter?
That's the thing about predestination. It's a real paradox, and it's something theologians have been arguing about for centuries.
Makes sense.
Augustine's critics, people like the Pelagians we talked about earlier, they thought this whole idea made God seem cruel, like he was playing favorites.
Yeah, picking some people for heaven and some for, well, not heaven, just because he felt like it.
Right. But Augustine believed that God's grace, it wasn't random, it wasn't arbitrary, it was all based on his perfect knowledge, his wisdom.
Okay, but even if God has a plan, how is that fair? I mean, to judge someone before they've even lived their life, to make choices, to decide whether they want God's grace or not.
Augustine would say it all comes down to this. Our human idea of justice, it's limited. We just can't grasp the full scope of God's plan or why he makes the choices he does. He really emphasized that mystery of God's grace, saying we've just got to accept it even if we don't get it.
I guess it would be a tough concept to swallow, especially if you're thinking you might be one of those people God didn't choose. But I guess in a way, it could also be comforting, right? Like knowing that your fate, even if it's not the one you pick, is in God's hands.
Exactly. And for Augustine, predestination, it wasn't supposed to scare people or make them feel hopeless. The point was to highlight how powerful God is and how much we humans need his grace.
This idea that God's in control and we're dependent on him, it seems like that would have a big impact on how Augustine saw the church's role, right?
Oh, absolutely. If God's grace is the only way to salvation, then the church, well, it becomes super important. It's the link between God and humans.
Right.
It's the church that does the sacraments, preaches, guides people on their path to, getting into heaven.
So, in a way, the church becomes this gatekeeper. You have to go through it to get God's grace.
You could see it that way, yeah. And that understanding of the church's role, it had a huge influence on how Christianity developed. It led to this whole hierarchy, this authority in, deciding what's right and wrong, even political power throughout history.
Wow. It's wild to think how an idea like predestination, it could end up shaping not just what people believe, but entire institutions and even society.
It really shows you the power of ideas, especially when they come from someone as bright and influential as Augustine. But as important as his impact on the church was, there's another part of his legacy that was, well, kind of controversial. His views on sex, sin, and the body.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Augustine, he wasn't exactly known for being progressive on sexuality.
He did have a pretty negative outlook on the body and our desires.
I mean, was he saying all desire is bad?
Pretty much. Augustine really believed that sex was how original sin got passed down through the generations. He called it concupiscence, basically this lustful desire that taints everything.
So he's saying that sex, even within marriage, it's this constant reminder that humans are inherently flawed.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Wow. I can see how that would change how people thought about their bodies and their desires. Like, you're born feeling ashamed, like something's wrong with you.
And that Augustinian view of sexuality, it stuck around. It had a lasting impact on Christian thought, especially in the West. It shaped attitudes towards marriage, celibacy, even the roles of women in society.
It's mind-blowing how a theological concept can have such a ripple effect, influencing culture and society like that. It really shows how our beliefs about things like sin and sex, they're all tied up with how we see ourselves and the world.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that ideas, they have consequences, good and bad. And Augustine's ideas, they were both brilliant and problematic. They still shape our world in ways we probably don't even realize. But before we get too deep into Augustine's legacy, I think it's time we took a closer look at one of his most famous works, The City of God.
Yeah, we've mentioned it a few times, but I think it's time we really dug into it. What are the main arguments, and how did it shape Augustine's view of history?
Well, The City of God, it was written because of something huge that happened, something that really shook the Roman world. The sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 AD.
This was when the Roman Empire, which seemed invincible, was attacked. Its capital city, sacked by barbarians.
It must have felt like the end of the world,
Yeah, I can only imagine.
A lot of pagans at the time, they blamed Christianity for the whole thing. They said it weakened the empire and angered the old gods. Augustine, when he wrote The City of God, he was defending Christianity against those accusations. He was trying to give people a new way to understand history, one that took into account the fall of Rome, but also said God would win in the end.
So he was writing during a crisis, trying to make sense of a world that was falling apart and offer some hope.
Exactly. And in the process, he came up with one of his most influential ideas. The idea of two cities, the city of God and the earthly city.
We talked about that concept a little earlier, but I'd love to hear more. What did Augustine mean by these two cities? Were they literal places or like metaphors?
They weren't places on a map. They represented two different ways of life, two sets of values. Like the city of God, it was all about loving God and your neighbor, seeking spiritual fulfillment, wanting to be saved in the afterlife. The earthly city, on the other hand, it was all about selfish desires, ambition, wanting power and pleasure in this life.
So it's less about where you live and more about where your heart is, what you truly value. Did Augustine see those cities as totally separate, or could there be some overlap?
That's a great question. Augustine believed that those two cities, they were woven together throughout history, always fighting for people's loyalty. People could belong to one city or the other based on their choices, their actions, what they ultimately desired.
So even within one society or even within one person, you could have those two opposing forces at work.
Precisely. And that tension between the city of God and the earthly city, it's played out in all sorts of ways throughout history. Political conflicts, social movements, even our own personal struggles.
Like the conflict between wanting what's best for ourselves versus what's best for everyone, or chasing after worldly success versus seeking spiritual growth. It's like Augustine gave us a framework to understand these conflicts that have always been a part of human history and society.
And that's one reason the city of God is still so influential. It's a deep reflection on good and evil, the meaning of history, where humanity is headed.
This brings us to another really important part of Augustine's thought. His view of history. He saw it as linear, right? Moving from creation to judgment day. A pretty different view than most ancient thinkers who saw history as this cycle, always repeating itself.
You got it. Augustine, he didn't see history as just a bunch of random events or empires rising and falling over and over again. He saw it as a story. It had a beginning, creation, a middle, the fall of man and Christ's sacrifice, and an end, judgment day.
So history was a narrative with a purpose. And God was the author, right? That's a pretty radical shift from the way people usually thought about history back then. What were the implications of that?
Well, it meant that human events had meaning. They had a purpose that went beyond the immediate circumstances. History became this story with the divine plan, a story arc moving towards good triumphing over evil.
So it wasn't just about what happens in this life. It was about our ultimate destiny where we fit into God's plan. But did Augustine think we had any say in all of this?
It goes back to that tension between predestination and free will. While Augustine emphasized God's power and his grace, he also believed we could choose to follow or resist God's will. But ultimately, he thought God's grace influences those choices.
It's this intricate dance between divine will and our own choices. And that tension between God's plan and our own free will, it's still something we grapple with today, just like Augustine.
Absolutely. And that's just one of the reasons why Augustine's work is still so relevant, so thought-provoking, even all these centuries later.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Saint Augustine. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've gone from his personal life and his theological battles to those big ideas about grace, predestination, the church. We even got into his views on, well, sex and sin.
Oh yeah, we covered a lot of ground. And of course we spent some time with his city of God, that whole concept of two cities, two ways of life, the city of God and the earthly city, always in tension.
And it's amazing how relevant his ideas still feel today. I mean, this is a guy who lived in the 5th century.
Right.
But what he was wrestling with, it still resonates.
That's the sign of a truly great thinker, isn't it? Their ideas, they go beyond their own time and speak to something, well, something fundamental about being human.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive, I want to shift gears a bit. Think about Augustine's legacy, his impact. How did his ideas shape not only Christianity, but Western civilization as a whole?
Well, there's no doubt Augustine had a huge impact on political thought. His two cities idea, it really influenced how people saw the relationship between church and state, between spiritual authority and, well, earthly power.
We talked about that tension a bit earlier, but could you unpack it a little more? How did this whole sacred versus secular thing play out historically?
Take the Middle Ages. Augustine's ideas were used to justify the church's claim to be, well, on top, higher than earthly rulers. The Pope, as the representative of Christ, had the ultimate authority, even over kings and emperors.
It seems like that would lead to conflict, having two sources of authority, both wanting to be in charge. Did Augustine think the church should actually rule? Like, did he want a theocracy?
Not exactly. He believed in the city of God being superior, but he didn't think the church should be directly involved in running things. He saw separate roles for church and state. The church guides souls towards salvation, the state keeps order and makes sure there's justice in the here and now.
So it was more about finding a balance, each having its own area of influence. Did this idea of keeping the spiritual and the temporal separate last beyond the Middle Ages?
Oh yeah. It had a long life. Even during the Enlightenment, when people were challenging all sorts of traditional authority, Augustine's ideas were still being debated and reinterpreted. His work laid the groundwork for those ongoing discussions about how religion and politics, faith and reason all fit together.
It's incredible that a philosopher writing in the 5th century could still be so influential in political theory centuries later. Mm-hmm. But his influence goes way beyond politics, right?
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Augustine's writings have shaped how we understand so many things. Time, history, human nature, even the nature of reality itself.
Speaking of time, we talked about how Augustine saw history as a line, moving from creation to Judgment Day. A pretty big change from the cyclical view that was common in ancient thought. But he also had some pretty interesting thoughts about time itself.
He did. He even said, and this is a famous quote, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I wish to explain it to him who asks, I know not."
I think everyone can relate to that. We all experience time, but trying to actually explain it, well, good luck. So how did Augustine approach this slippery concept?
He argued that time, it's not something out there, objective and existing apart from us. He thought time was more of a subjective experience, something we create in our minds.
So time is all in our heads. That's a pretty trippy idea.
It is, and he tied this idea of time to memory and anticipation. For Augustine, the present moment is so fleeting, it's almost like it doesn't exist. It's only through memory that we can grasp the past, and through anticipation that we imagine the future.
So time is this constant flow, but we only experience it in little bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Through our own subjective lens. Did this idea of time have legs? Did it influence anyone else?
Absolutely. Augustine's idea that time is subjective, shaped by memory and anticipation, it went on to have a huge influence in philosophy, literature, even psychology. People are still thinking about it today.
It's amazing how his insights, all from thinking about theology and looking inward, had such a ripple effect on other fields, totally outside of religion.
It just shows you how universal these questions he was grappling with are. His thoughts on time, memory, consciousness, they resonate with anyone who's ever, pondered the big mysteries of existence.
Okay, so Augustine had some thoughts on time. But what about history? We already talked about his linear view, that it wasn't just a cycle repeating itself. How did that new way of looking at history play out in the long run?
Well, one of the big implications was that it gave human events meaning, a purpose that wasn't tied to the rise and fall of empires. History became a story, but a story with a divine plan, a story arc that's moving towards good overcoming evil in the end.
So it wasn't just random stuff happening. It was a story, and it had a happy ending. At least for those on the right side of God's plan, I bet that had a huge impact on how people saw themselves and their place in the world.
It did. This idea that history was unfolding according to God's plan, it gave people hope. Even when things were tough, they had something to hold on to. It helped them make sense of the crazy stuff that was happening around them. The Roman Empire collapsing, Christianity growing, barbarian invasions. It gave them a way to find meaning in the chaos.
It's a powerful message. Very comforting, especially when times are hard. But I can see how Augustine's view of history could be, well, maybe misused.
You're right. His focus on the city of God, it could be used to justify intolerance, to say that people outside the church are doomed. And that kind of thinking, it can lead to some pretty bad stuff. Persecution, crusades, violence in the name of religion.
That's a good reminder that even the best ideas, they can be twisted, used to hurt people.
It shows how important it is to be critical, to think for yourself when it comes to any philosophy or theology. We can't just blindly accept things. We have to watch out for misinterpretations and the dangers of just taking things on faith without questioning them.
So it sounds like Augustine's legacy is a bit of a mixed bag. He gave us some incredible insights into what it means to be human, but his ideas have also been used to justify some pretty terrible actions.
That's a fair way to put it. And that's why it's so important to engage with his work in a critical way, to appreciate how brilliant he was, but also to recognize the potential for his ideas to be misused. We can't just accept everything he said without thinking about it. We have to grapple with the complexities and the contradictions in his thought.
It's been quite a ride, hasn't it? Exploring Augustine's thought, his legacy, the impact of his ideas. But I have to ask, what is it about Augustine that makes him so enduring? Why are we still talking about him after all these centuries?
That's a good question, one worth thinking about. I think there are a few reasons. First, he was an amazing writer, a brilliant thinker. He could explain really complex ideas in a way that was engaging, thought-provoking. Even today, his writing has this power to resonate, to make you think.
Yeah, even reading him now, you can feel the force of his intellect, his passion. You can sense his struggle to understand the world and his place in it.
Right. Second, Augustine was incredibly introspective. He wrestled with those huge questions, good and evil, suffering, truth, in a way that feels so relatable even now. He was honest about his struggles, his doubts, his temptations, and that honesty, it makes his work feel genuine, human.
It's that humanness, that willingness to be vulnerable that makes him so compelling. He wasn't just some distant intellectual. He was someone who grappled with the same questions we all do.
Exactly. And finally, I think Augustine endures because he was wrestling with timeless questions. The nature of time, the meaning of history, faith and reason, the tension between what we want and what we aspire to. These are themes that still captivate us, just like they captivated Augustine.
So even though his world was so different from ours, the questions he asked, they're still relevant. And that's why his work continues to challenge and inspire us centuries later.
Well said. I think we've come full circle in our Augustine deep dive. We've looked at his ideas, his legacy, the power of his thinking.
And I hope we've given our listeners something to think about, some new perspectives on history, philosophy, maybe even their own lives.
That's what we aim for. Thanks for joining us on this intellectual adventure. We encourage you to keep exploring the world of St. Augustine. There's a lot to discover.
And until next time, keep diving deep.